Hi, welcome to Pattern Making with Leigh. I did an Oscar poll last week and Gwyneth Paltrow in Tom Ford was the clear winner, which is my favourite too. Now I'm going to show you how to make it.
I'll break it down into 3 parts: back dress, front dress and cape.
And I was actually really surprised the cape was made this way because it's a much better, neater way to do this. But more on that later. Let's do the easiest part first, the back.
I would start with my clicked torso block, which you can see here at quarter scale. My back is on the fold, so I need to add a centre back seam. You can move the neck dart into the centre back seam by sculpting it in at the top. Then I curve it down to bring it in 1 centimetre at the waist and back out again. I'm letting the dart excess guide how much I remove along the centre back seam. Then I need to make the dart smaller so the block has the same measurements. Why add a centre back seam? It allows you to sculpt more evenly around the body, which looks better because it's more accurate. I would then extend the hem, and the last bit is the shoulder seam. This looks like a unique custom-made curved shoulder pad. You can make one by layering or chopping up standard shoulder pads. To make room for the pad, I'll reshape the shoulder seam so it goes up and further out. Then I'll curve it down rather sharply. See the rounded edge? The armhole also extends out over the arm. I then check the fit by trialing the pattern over the shoulder pad on a mannequin, and I draw the same shoulder seam shape on the front. Now let's drape the front. Here's my torso block base I prepared earlier. Before I drape, I need to draft the neckline and shoulder sections. I always like to know the edges before I drape. It helps me work out the proportions. You can see most of the drape is at a 45-degree angle, which makes sense because draping always looks best on the bias. So I'll pin the fabric I'm going to use to drape the front, so the grain line is running along the centre front. Draping is an art, so take your time. My first tip is to get your edges worked out before. Second tip is drape on a base, because, well, you can see the dress is lined, and it's much easier and more accurate to work out the neckline and armhole shape of the lining while the drape is on top, rather than trying to create a lining pattern from a drape pattern. So I did both at the same time. Secondly, you can stitch the drape to the lining to help you secure its shape. This is a really important industry tip. I talk a lot about my Mastering the Art of Draping video, which is a must watch if you plan on draping anything. And that's the drape done. To learn how to turn it into a pattern, watch my Mastering the Art of Draping video. The cape is pretty simple. You just need to extend the shoulder seam down the arm. I'd use the back I created as the base, and rather than curve under to create the rounded shape, I'd extend it to the full length of the arm.
So that's how they did the cape.
But see how it's puckering and sagging?
I think this is probably because it's on the bias or it hasn't been shaped correctly. Either way, there's a much better way to do cape patterns and a much cleaner, neater finish. This is how I do all my capes when I worked at Senior Pattern Maker at Jenny Packham, and here's how I would do it.
I would get my back pattern, draw a line straight down from the across back measurement, which is the widest part of the back, get my sleeve and lie it on top of the back so the points where they would be sewn would match up. Then I'll get my front with the correct shoulder seam shape and stick it where it would be sewn on the other side of the sleeve so the points line up horizontally. Now wait for it. I know it looks like a hot mess, but the magic is coming. Let's trace it off. And this is my cape pattern. First, you sew the top of the sleeve section to this notch. Then, when that is sewn, just sew the front and back together along the shoulder seam.
Isn't that a much nicer pattern? Hope you enjoyed this video. If you're feeling inspired, grab one of my clicked pattern kits. Starting with a good block and following one of my guides will make pattern making so much easier. Or check out that draping video I mentioned earlier. Or you can watch how I made Michelle Yeoh's Balenciaga Oscar dress.